why you have to make all these excuses for her? This, like I said, all this was this week was people who said, oh, she ran a flawless campaign. How ridiculous. Or it's sexism, it's racism. This is an old playbook.
Yes, I didn't say any of those things.
I know, but I've heard a lot of these things. And like, I think America's perfectly willing to elect a woman. They just didn't like the last two that were put up.
All right, buckle up, because today we're diving headfirst into one of the most ridiculous political blame games we've seen in years. And trust me, there's competition. We're talking about the media meltdown over Kamala Harris's election loss to Donald Trump, and more specifically, the excuses pouring out of MSNBC like they're on tap. You'd think by now they'd have moved on. You'd think they'd at least have swapped out the "it's sexism, it's racism" card for something fresh. But nope. Same old playbook, same old lines, just dusted off for the occasion. And honestly, Bill Maher wasn't having it. The man just dropped a sledgehammer on this pity parade, and I'm here for it. Let's rewind a bit.
But you're either the person who's Googling the day before, did Biden drop out, or you know in a week. You know, did anyone in this audience not know enough about Kamala Harris pretty much after a week to make a decision?
All week, pundits have been on air insisting Harris's campaign was flawless. Flawless. Really? That's like saying New Coke was a flawless product launch, or that Cats, yes, the nightmare fuel movie, was flawless filmmaking. This wasn't flawless. This wasn't even close. And when that argument started falling apart, out came the backup excuses: sexism, racism, voter ignorance. Here's the thing, America's perfectly capable of electing a woman. We've just had the misfortune of seeing the wrong women put forward the last couple of tries.
It's sexism, it's racism. This is an old playbook.
Yes, I didn't say any of those things.
I know, but I've heard a lot of these things. And like, I think America's perfectly willing to elect a woman. They just didn't like the last two that were put up.
That's not misogyny, that's just not being impressed. And that's allowed. Now, here's where it gets spicy. Maher points out that Kamala spent 3.5 years basically shoved into a political broom closet. I mean, she was so invisible, her approval rating probably improved just from people forgetting she existed. And then, with only 107 days left before the election, she's suddenly the face of the Democratic ticket. Some of the pundits tried to act like that's just not enough time for America to get to know her.
But the Vice President of the United States is basically shoved in a broom closet for 3.5 years.
I know.
Like, you couldn't.
She was more popular in there.
Yes, well.
I mean, this idea that in a mass media age, that 107 days is not long enough to know somebody?
You are way overestimating the American people in terms of what they.
No.
You have someone like Donald Trump has become a universally known, understood, loved by some, hated by others over the course of being omnipresent for 8 years.
Oh, please. This isn't the 1800s. We live in an era where Donald Trump can dominate the national conversation for 8 straight years without even trying. You think Americans need a full decade to form an opinion on someone? They didn't need that for Trump. They didn't need that for Obama. And they sure didn't need it for Kamala. MSNBC and their friends in the media bubble don't want to admit this. But here's the uncomfortable truth. People already did know her. They just didn't like her. Period. Now let's talk about the media silos Maher brought up, because this is where it gets really telling. He's absolutely right. The right has its own spaces now, but this whole concept, it didn't start on the right. It was born when the left took control of legacy media, CNN, MSNBC, NPR, and used it like a political shield. Bad stories about Democrats spiked. Embarrassing moments edited out. Opponents turned into villains on a loop. For years, Trump was the punching bag every single day, every single news cycle. Meanwhile, Democrats got the soft lighting, the gentle music, and the questions that sounded like they were lifted from a Hallmark card. That's not journalism, that's PR, and people caught on.
All right, do the Democrats need a social media platform, this is for you, John, of their own to combat the Republican influence on Twitter? Well, I mean, I don't know, but Twitter, it's funny. It used to be completely left. Then Elon said, I'm going to take it over, so it's going to be 50-50 right down the middle. He didn't do that. It just switched completely. So I don't know. It's terrible that I think that we have our own media silos. We need places where, like this show, but there's not enough of them, where everybody comes and everybody hears everybody else from all points of view.
That's why millions turn to independent voices. Podcasters like Joe Rogan, Theo Vaughn, and others who weren't afraid to break the narrative wide open. These guys weren't pretending to be neutral, but at least they weren't filtering every story through a partisan fog machine. And you know what? Those platforms ended up having more impact on the election than all the legacy media combined, which is hilarious when you think about how hard the left worked to control the conversation. They had the keys to Twitter, the headlines, the broadcast networks, and they still got outmaneuvered by a bunch of bro-friendly podcasts recorded in garages.
I think the deeper question that the question's getting at is that if you look at the data in this election, the amount of reach of all of these alternative, I'm talking about the whole podcast space mostly, but also social media, the interviews that Trump did, not starting with Rogan, but Theo Vaughn and all of these other things he did, incredible reach compared to old mainstream media, right? Where
then John Heilemann, oh boy, decides to say Twitter isn't a real place. Convenient. It was real enough when it was being used to ban stories, throttle accounts, and push one-sided narratives. But now that Elon Musk owns it, suddenly it's a cesspool that doesn't matter. That's not moral clarity. That's sore loser syndrome. And you can tell they know it because whenever the conversation edges toward admitting the bias, they start tiptoeing, wrapping every half-truth in soft language. It's like watching someone walk barefoot across Lego pieces. You can see the pain, but they're determined to get to the other side without screaming.
I'd like to steal a line from Dave Chappelle, who said at some point how he doesn't know very much about what goes on Twitter because he doesn't go on Twitter because Twitter's not a real place. That's sort of how I feel about Twitter. And Twitter, not only is Twitter not a real place, but it's become a toxic cesspool filled with nothing, not about right, it's not about conservative, it's just filled with misinformation, disinformation, and conspiracy theories. So I would rather not have the left replicate that. If that's what's required.
Then we get to the inflation excuse. Oh, this one's rich. Heilemann claims voters' frustration over the economy was mostly perception, as in people didn't really have it that bad. They just thought they did. Yeah, tell that to the family whose grocery bill doubled. Tell it to the small business owner barely holding on because rent and utilities skyrocketed. Tell it to literally anyone who's had to fill up their tank in the last few years. Perception, this was reality hitting people right in the bank account. Gas prices through the roof, mortgage rates over 7%, wages flat while everything else climbed. You didn't need a pollster to tell you things weren't working. You just needed to look in your fridge and see what wasn't there.
If you're the sitting vice president for a president who has, throughout his entire term in office, been sitting at about somewhere between a 35 and 40% approval rating. People view the Biden administration as a failure. We can have a long discussion about whether they are right about that, about the economy, but the perceptions of the economy were that people thought inflation was too high, people thought we were on the wrong track, 75% wrong track numbers, and this huge inflation overhang. You're the sitting vice president, and you get put on elevated to the top of the ticket 107 days ahead of the election. I think that is a very high degree of difficulty to put on anybody, and I do not think she is the perfect candidate. I tend to agree with Sarah that probably in a fully litigated primary, she probably would not have been the Democratic nominee, but we'll never know that. But I will tell you that, there's never been anybody who's had the difficulty of that situation, elevated that late in the campaign. Why?
And here's the elitist kicker. When Heilemann suggests 107 days wasn't enough for America to get to know Kamala, what he's really saying is, you're too dumb to figure this stuff out quickly. That's not just wrong, it's insulting. Americans didn't reject Kamala because they were confused. They rejected her because they were paying attention. And Maher, to his credit, pushes back. He says, look, other countries run their elections in weeks. They don't need years of campaign theater to size up a candidate, and neither do we. By the end of the first week, most people already had Kamala pegged. They'd seen the awkward cackles, the meandering speeches, the inability to land a clear point. You don't need an extra year to figure out whether that inspires confidence. But
Barack Obama becomes president of the United States after running for 2 years as president, runs a 50-state primary, is on television, does dozens of Democratic debates, and by the time at the end of that, most people knew who he was. Most people. Yeah. You drop somebody into the middle of the top of the ticket, 3 days out, 3 months out, you are going to have to spend a lot of time trying to introduce yourself to the country while also being in a steel cage death match with Donald Trump.
Okay, but I don't know if you ever watched this show, but I had Michael Douglas on this week.
Yeah.
At the top, We were talking about this, and he made a very good point that every other country in the world can do it in months, sometimes weeks. Why can every other country do it in that short a period of time? Are they all that so much brighter than America?
Heilemann keeps circling back to this late decider argument. You know, those mythical voters who supposedly walk into the booth still unsure. Maher compares them to Christmas Eve shoppers, people who wait until the last minute to make a decision.
Is it your contention is that no people were late deciders in the election?
No, they
Nobody
were. I
decided-
talked about them last week.
Right,
Christmas Eve shoppers,
so those
I
people,
called
so those people apparently needed longer than 90
they would have been
days.
undecided.
They always would have been.
Exactly.
They always would have
That's why I call them. I called them, John, I said this last week, I called them Christmas Eve shoppers. My father was one. People who don't buy their presents until the Christmas Eve night. He would go into the store, and he wouldn't feel like he could do it until he was fully in the spirit. You had to be in the store on Christmas Eve with Santa and all the fucking elves and everything.
Here's the thing, last-minute voters aren't clueless. They're just cautious. They know the candidates. They've been paying attention. They're just holding out to see who makes the better closing argument. And when that argument falls flat, it's not because they needed more time. It's because they didn't like what they heard. Which brings us full circle. The media can spin this however they want. Flawless campaign, unfair sexism, not enough time. But the bottom line is simple. People knew Kamala Harris. They heard her message, and they decided she wasn't it.
Why you have to make all these excuses for her? This, like I said, all this was this week was people who said, oh, she ran a flawless campaign. How ridiculous. Or it's sexism, it's racism. This is an old playbook.
Yes, I didn't say any of those things.
I know, but I've heard a lot of these things. And like, I think America's perfectly willing to elect a woman. They just didn't like the last two that were put up.
That's not misogyny. That's not ignorance. That's democracy. And the sooner the DNC and their media allies stop blaming the voters and start actually listening to them, the sooner they might win again. Until then, they're just going to keep losing and blaming it on everything but themselves. So, what do you think? Was this really about timing? Or are the Democrats just allergic to accountability? Drop your thoughts below, smash that like button if you're tired of political excuses, and make sure you subscribe because next time, we're diving into why the media is more panicked about losing control of the narrative than losing elections. And trust me, that's where it gets really messy.